All right, so as a chef, I very frequently get asked about home kitchen equipment. How do we set up our kitchen? What equipment do we really need? What kitchen equipment can we kind of skip, right? And so I wanted to take a minute to kind of discuss that, right? So I'll show you what I have in my home kitchen and what I recommend as being the very basics for others. So when it comes to knives, you really only need three. You don't need a big block with a whole bunch of different specialty knives. Of course, I went to culinary school and was forced to buy a big set of all these knives, but I very rarely use any of them outside of these three. The first is a chef's knife. So I have an 8-inch chef's knife and I have a 9-inch chef's knife, and I have to say I really prefer the 8-inch. The 9-inch is probably too big for most folks. You can buy a 6 or a 7-inch chef's knife if you have kind of a smaller hand, but I think an 8-inch chef's knife is probably a nice place to start. Then you're going to want a paring knife. This is very small. I use this, for instance, when I'm hulling strawberries or if I'm trying to core an apple, right? But a paring knife for really kind of small things can be super helpful. And then finally, a bread knife, also called a serrated knife. So if I'm slicing a tomato, I sometimes want this. Of course, bread, I'll slice this using a serrated knife. But I would say really these are the only three knives you need. And for something like 95 or more % of what I'm doing in the kitchen, I use a chef's knife. I think people are just scared of it because it's really large, but a large knife makes the work much easier as long as you can figure out how to kind of hold it safely in your hand. So really, if you're just getting started, go ahead and buy three of these knives. My favorite brand is Wusthof. That's what I use, but really anything you can find is going to be good. The key is to keep it sharp, right? And so you've probably seen that honing blade where you kind of go like this with the knife. That is honing the knife. That is not sharpening the knife. And so really you probably want to get your knives sharpened maybe once a year. And if it's been longer than that, I promise you it's worth the $10 or so that it's going to cost to get that one knife sharpened. And then you can just kind of keep it sharp by using that honing blade, right? So the sharp knife, and just a few of them, is really going to take you a long way in the kitchen. Cutting boards. I have a wooden cutting board that I use for most everything. It works really, really well. You can wash it off. It takes a little bit of mineral oil every once in a while to keep it nice and hydrated. And that's kind of my go-to. It's really not tough on your knife. And then for meat and seafood and other things like that where I'm pretty worried about cross-contamination, I actually have one of these plastic cutting boards, and I think most people are familiar with using these. You know, the more and more that we learn about microplastics, I would say the more and more I'm concerned about them, honestly. And so these cutting boards that are made out of plastic, every time you're cutting them, some of that plastic really is flaking off, right? And so we're hoping that it ends up in the trash or in the sink, but I bet some of it is getting into the food, right? So I might not recommend these. Instead, there's this kind of cardboard type of material. You might also see a brand called paperboard. This one here is Epicurean. And they take all this paper and they just basically smash it together. This can go in the dishwasher. It's considered food safe for things like salmon and other fish and meat, right? But it doesn't have those microplastics in it. So all in all, kind of pick your poison here, but I would recommend using a wooden cutting board for most things, and then perhaps one of these paper or cardboard composite cutting boards for your meat and your seafood. Pots and pans. You can spend a lot of money on pots and pans, just like knives, but again, I don't think too many really are required. So I recommend a small non-stick skillet. My favorite is ceramic to kind of avoid that Teflon material, right? And this ceramic can still go in the dishwasher. It'll last you 3 or 5 years. Great for making eggs and small things like that. I have a couple of large skillets. I love my all-clad skillets. They're expensive, they have a lifetime warranty, and they can go in the dishwasher. To me, both of those things are worth it. But a large, like stainless steel skillet is going to get you a long way. Buy a 2 or 3-quart saucepan, which is good, of course, for sauces, but then things like macaroni and cheese and small batches of mashed potatoes, and you know what to do in a saucepan. That's a pretty common one. I also like a 5-quart Dutch oven. The one you see here is enamel, so it can be really good for browning meat, but also making things like soups and stews and pasta sauces and meatballs. And so it can go in the oven, which is really beneficial. So I would recommend getting a 5-quart Dutch oven. And then finally, you can think about whether or not to get a cast iron pan. Kind of needy and high maintenance to take care of, right? But if you can keep that really nice coating on it, then it's relatively non-stick. Again, super good for browning meat, can go into the oven, And as heavy and as durable as it is, this will last you many lifetimes. You will pass this on for generations, right? But this cast iron skillet probably cost you 20 bucks on Amazon, made here in the USA. So some really good options there. I like to keep 1 or 2 of those on hand as well. But again, plus or minus on the cast iron. That's up to you. And then the last thing I would really recommend investing in is some baking sheets and some wire racks. So sometimes you want to put something in the oven and it's going to go directly on the baking sheet. So if you have some baking sheets, you're all set there. Other times you want to put something in the oven, but you want that hot air from the oven to get all around the piece of food that you're cooking. So in those instances, you would take one of these wire racks, put it on the baking sheet, and then put the food on the wire rack. And that way the hot air is able to get all around it. They can similarly be very helpful if you're doing baked goods and you want to cool them. So you take them out of the oven and then you take it out of the pan and you set it on the wire rack in order to allow that cold air to kind of get around and cool the baked good from all sides. So I think sometimes people are buying special cooling pans and racks and things like that. It's not necessary. Just buy a wire rack that fits inside a baking sheet and you're all set. Now, how do we set it up? You really want to be efficient here because being efficient saves you time. And so everything is going to center around where you're cooking. So that's going to be your stove and your oven. This is my real apartment kitchen that I'm showing you here, and this is my real setup. So you see my prep station here with my cutting board and my knives. This is right next to the stove, so I can chop and drop. I have some cooking utensils here, which again, I'm keeping right next to the stove. I keep some in that drawer on the right, and I keep many of the ones that I use frequently in this jar next to the stovetop. Similarly, pots and pans as close to the stove as possible so that you're not carrying huge cast iron Dutch ovens across the kitchen, right? And when you need to grab an extra baking sheet, it's right there. So keep your pots and pans close. Things that you're going to be adding frequently to the stove or to the oven when you're cooking, things like oils, salts, peppers, all of that you can keep really close to your cooktop there. I like to have either a garbage or a garbage bowl super close. When I design my own kitchen someday, it'll be a garbage, and ideally it'll be one that's built into the countertop, and I can just slide things into the garbage, right? But in the meantime, I have this garbage bowl that I like to use. This keeps you from making many, many trips back and forth to the garbage if your garbage isn't close. So highly recommend that. I have a comfy mat because I'm an old man. I have kitchen towels, and I like to use one for my hands, and then the one on the right is kind of what I use for everything else, right? So I like to have a couple kitchen towels at all times. And like I mentioned, I'm an old man, and so I have a kettle for my French press every morning. This is totally optional, but that's pretty much the basics of what you want in your kitchen and kind of how to lay it out. Again, centering everything around the stove or the oven. So now that we have all of our kitchen equipment and we have our stove and everything around it kind of set up nicely, it's time to learn how to do some quick and tasty cooking.